Alright, let's talk about Rick Ross for a minute, because something about his situation lately has been getting a little strange. And if you've been following hip-hop for a while, you already know Rick Ross has always been one of those artists who somehow stays around controversy. Not always huge scandals, but there's always something happening around him. A beef, a business situation, an interview, some kind of drama that keeps his name circulating in the culture. But recently, people started paying attention again, and the reason is actually pretty interesting. Because for a long time, Rick Ross had a very specific role in hip-hop. He wasn't necessarily the most dominant rapper of his generation, and he wasn't always chasing mainstream attention the way some other artists were. Instead, Ross built his reputation around something else entirely: power, presence, the image of being a larger-than-life figure in the rap industry. When you think of Rick Ross, you don't just think of music, you think of the entire lifestyle he represents. Luxury cars, massive houses, private jets, business deals. Rick Ross spent years carefully building this image of a rap mogul who was always in control of the situation, and for the most part, it worked. But here's where things start to get complicated, because over the last few years, hip-hop has changed a lot. The artists dominating the conversation today aren't necessarily the same artists who ruled the 2000s. The internet moves faster now, trends change faster, and attention spans are shorter than ever, which means artists have to constantly find ways to stay relevant. Now, Rick Ross has always been good at staying visible in the culture. Sometimes it's through music, sometimes through interviews, and sometimes through, let's just say, strategic drama. But recently, people started noticing something interesting about how often Ross pops up in conversations involving other artists. For example, his long history with 50 Cent. Now, if you remember that situation, you already know it wasn't a small disagreement. That feud lasted years, and it became one of the most entertaining rivalries hip-hop fans had seen in a long time. Social media trolling, public interviews, constant back-and-forth shots. And even though that conflict eventually cooled down, it created a reputation that Rick Ross has never completely escaped. Because when artists have a history of public feuds, people start paying closer attention whenever their name appears next to another artist. And lately, Ross has been finding himself mentioned in conversations involving some of the biggest names in rap, again, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, but enough that fans started asking a new question. Is Rick Ross still in the same position he used to be in? Or is the industry starting to shift around him? Now, this doesn't mean Rick Ross suddenly lost his influence. Far from it. His catalog is still respected, his brand is still powerful, and his ability to stay relevant in hip-hop for over 15 years is actually pretty impressive. But the modern rap landscape is very different from the one Ross originally dominated. Back then, album releases and radio hits were the main ways artists competed. Now, everything revolves around viral moments, streaming numbers, and constant online attention, which creates a completely different kind of pressure. Because if an artist isn't constantly part of the conversation, the internet moves on quickly, and sometimes the way artists try to stay in the conversation can create unexpected problems. That's why some fans have been analyzing Rick Ross's recent appearances and comments more closely than usual. Not because Ross suddenly changed overnight, but because the environment around him has changed. And when the industry changes, even experienced artists have to adapt. Some adapt perfectly, others struggle to keep the same level of influence they once had. The interesting thing about Rick Ross is that he's always been extremely confident in his position within hip-hop. If you watch his interviews, he rarely seems worried about what other artists are doing. He speaks like someone who already built his empire and doesn't feel threatened by anyone else. But the internet doesn't always see things that way. Fans constantly debate rankings, they debate relevance, they debate who's still dominating the culture and who might be slowly fading from the spotlight. And when Rick Ross's name comes up in those conversations, the opinions are starting to become more divided. Some people still see him as one of the last true rap moguls. Others think the industry has already moved into a completely different era. Which brings us back to the situation people keep discussing right now, because when artists like Rick Ross find themselves in these kinds of conversations, the next move they make becomes extremely important. One big moment can completely shift the narrative. A successful project, A viral interview, a surprise collaboration, any of those things can instantly remind people why an artist became influential in the first place. But if the momentum keeps slowing down, the conversation can shift in the opposite direction just as quickly. That's why fans are watching Rick Ross more closely than usual right now, not because his career is suddenly over, but because hip-hop history has shown us something very interesting. Even the most powerful artists eventually reach a moment where the culture starts asking, what happens next? And right now, Rick Ross might be standing right at that moment. The question is, whether his next move reminds everyone why he built his empire, or whether the rap industry has already started moving in a completely different direction. Because in hip-hop, the spotlight never stays in one place forever, and the artists who survive the longest are the ones who know exactly when it's time to make their next move. And that's exactly why the Rick Ross situation has people paying attention again.